A quiet plane ride turns into a storm when 12-year-old Tanya Satterfield becomes the target of a white businessman's explosive temper. What started as a harmless moment, a child shifting in her seat, spirals into a confrontation fueled by entitlement and prejudice. As passengers freeze and flight attendants fumble, one man watches closely, his instincts sharpened by years of military training. In a space thousands of feet above the ground, the rules bend and justice hangs by a thread. When fear grips the cabin, will someone step up before it's too late? Tanya Satterfield could already feel the stares before she reached her seat. She wasn't sure if it was because she had on her favorite SpongeBob hoodie or if it was because she was bouncing too much when she walked, but she felt eyes. Grown-up eyes, the kind that weren't smiling. She kept close to her dad's side, her tiny hand clutching his larger one with trust and excitement. This was her first time flying. Derek had promised it would be fun. Window seats, snacks, and movies, he said. You'll barely feel like you're in the sky. But Tanya didn't care about movies or snacks right now. She just wanted to sit down and not trip over anyone's bag. Row 17, seats B and C. Derek let her in first, slipping her backpack into the overhead bin before taking his own seat beside her. Tanya slid into the chair by the window and immediately pressed her fingers to the glass. Her eyes widened. The wings stretched far, glinting in the sunlight, with fuel trucks buzzing around below. She gasped, "Daddy, it's like a whole little city down there." Derek smiled, tugging his seatbelt over his lap. Airports are like ants, busy everywhere, but they know where they're going. Tanya nodded, her braids bouncing. Then came the voice. She kicked my bag. The man's tone didn't match the volume of the cabin. It was sharp, too sharp. Tanya turned her head slowly, unsure if she heard him right. Across the aisle, one row behind, a white man in a pale blue button-down shirt sat with his face pinched tight. His fingers pressed into the armrest like he was trying to snap it in two. "I'm sorry," Derek said, his tone firm but polite. "Shh, he just kicked my carry-on," the man snapped again. "Some people teach their kids to behave. Guess that's optional these days." Tanya shrank back in her seat, cheeks flushing. She didn't remember kicking anything. Maybe when she turned into the row, maybe her foot hit the corner of something, but not hard. Not on purpose. Derek's posture didn't shift, but his eyes did. "Sir, she's 12. If she bumped something, it wasn't intentional." The man sneered. "Intentional or not, I don't want her touching my belongings. That bag has equipment in it. Expensive." Tanya's voice came out small. "I didn't mean to." "You heard her," Derek said, sharper this time. "She said it wasn't on purpose. Let's keep this flight peaceful." The man grunted and turned forward, muttering under his breath. But it wasn't quiet enough. "Figures," he hissed. "No accountability." Tanya's stomach flipped. She hated that word. She didn't even know what it really meant, but she knew how it was said, like a blade dipped in honey. The rest of the passengers continued boarding, oblivious or pretending to be. A flight attendant passed by, asking everyone to take their seats. The engines began to hum. Tanya leaned toward her father. "Can we trade seats? I don't want to sit by him." Derek gave her a nod and a tight smile. "After takeoff, baby. Just hold tight for now." The captain's voice crackled through the speakers. Tanya barely heard it. Her eyes drifted back to the man across the aisle. He hadn't stopped glaring at her, and his leg bounced in short, angry jerks. His name, she would later find out, was Gregory Hayes, but for now he was just a man with a loud voice, bitter eyes, and a short fuse. As the plane rolled backward, preparing to taxi, Gregory leaned into the aisle and pressed the call button above his seat. A chime echoed, and within seconds a flight attendant appeared. Blonde, mid-30s, bright blue scarf looped neatly around her neck. "Yes, sir. Is something wrong?" He gestured toward Tanya without looking at her. "The child across from me is being disruptive. She already kicked my belongings. If she can't sit still, you might want to do something before takeoff." The woman blinked, thrown. "Sir, we're about to taxi. Please remain seated." Gregory leaned back slowly, not satisfied but patient. "For now." Tanya's eyes welled, and she blinked fast, wiping them before her father saw. But Derek already knew. He reached over and gently took her hand, giving it a squeeze. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I didn't mean to, Daddy." "I know," he whispered. The wheels left the ground minutes later, but Tanya didn't feel like she was flying anymore. Not the way she imagined, not light and magical. Just trapped in a seat, across from a stranger who looked at her like she wasn't supposed to exist. She tried watching the clouds. She even pulled out her earbuds, but the tension was louder than anything music could drown out. Midway through the flight, after drinks were served and the lights dimmed slightly, Gregory shifted again. The plane jolted slightly from turbulence. Tanya barely moved. But Gregory slammed his hand on his tray. "That's it," he barked, startling everyone nearby. He shot up in his seat and turned to face Derek. "You need to control your child. That's the second time she's hit my seat. I'm warning you, one more time." Derek stood up, slow and deliberate, his full frame now towering beside Tanya's small one. "Do not talk to my daughter like that." "Oh, now you want to be a father?" Gregory snapped. "Real fatherhood means discipline. You people always think—" That's when Calvin Morris turned his head. He hadn't said a word the entire flight. Seated across the aisle, one row up, he had headphones in and eyes half shut. But that sentence, those words, cut through everything. Calvin paused his music and slowly removed his earbuds. His voice was low, calm. "Hey." Gregory turned toward him, irritated. "Mind your own." I said, "Sit down." The way Calvin said it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like an order. The kind of voice that had barked across desert sands, over boat decks, into chaos and fire and war. It wasn't loud, but it made the air go still. Gregory's mouth opened, then closed. His fists clenched at his sides. His eyes bounced between Derek and Calvin. Then he sat. Not gracefully, not in defeat, but in confusion, like his grip on the moment slipped. The flight attendant appeared again, this time with another crew member behind her. "Is everything all right here?" No one spoke for a moment. Then Calvin turned back to his seat. "We're fine, for now." The attendant gave a nervous nod and walked away. Tanya exhaled, finally. Her shoulders dropped a little. Derek remained standing for a few extra seconds before sitting back down beside her, eyes still locked on Gregory, who now stared straight ahead. She turned to her father, voice soft. "Who was that man who helped?" Derek smiled for the first time in over half an hour. "Someone who remembers what it means to serve." Tanya didn't sleep. The plane hummed steadily overhead, a lullaby for some, but not for her. Her cheek leaned against the cool window, but her eyes stayed open, darting between stars and shadows. Somewhere beneath all that darkness was home, or maybe the ocean, or maybe nothing. She didn't know. She just knew she didn't feel safe up here. Across the aisle, Gregory Hayes hadn't moved in a while. His arms were crossed, his jaw tight, and the faint blue glow from the overhead light drew long lines across his forehead. The silence between them buzzed, louder than the engines. Derek had switched seats with her after takeoff. Tanya sat on the aisle now, tucked beside her dad, legs still. She hadn't said a word since the man yelled again. Not after the flight attendant walked off. Not after the man in the black hoodie stood up and made Gregory sit. That voice, the one that stopped everything, it still echoed in her head. She peeked toward the front. That man was calm again, relaxed almost. He had his arms folded and head back like nothing had happened. His name tag from earlier, when he pulled out his boarding pass, had read C. Morris. She didn't know what the C stood for, but Tanya had her own guesses. Courage, calm, something like that. The plane shifted slightly in the air. Not enough to notice, but enough to make the soda cans on the flight attendant's cart clink against each other. Tanya flinched. Derek noticed. "You okay, Bug?" She nodded, then whispered, "I don't like him." Derek didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He looked down at her for a second, then rubbed his hand gently across the top of her braids. "Just one more hour," he said. "We'll be on the ground soon. Then we walk away from this and never see him again." Tanya looked down at her hands. Her fingers were still balled up in her sleeves. "He was mean, but people didn't do anything. They just stared." "I know," Derek said. "I thought grown-ups were supposed to stop stuff like that." His lips pressed into a line. "Some do," he said carefully. "Some forget how." A small cough came from across the aisle, not from Gregory, but from someone behind him. Tanya glanced back. A woman with brown curls and a toddler in her lap gave her a kind smile. She offered a little wave. Tanya returned it, slow and unsure. The woman mouthed, "You're brave." Tanya didn't feel brave. She felt tired. Behind that woman, another man had his phone out, not for games or music, but filming. The red dot blinked in the corner of his screen. He'd been recording since the shouting started, maybe even before. She hadn't noticed him earlier. He wore a hoodie, too, like the man who stood up, his face calm, but his eyes, those were serious. A voice broke through the stillness. "Excuse me." Calvin Morris had turned in his seat again. He was speaking to the flight attendant, the same one from before, now standing at the edge of the galley. Her name tag read Avery. She looked exhausted, pale and unsure. "Yes, sir? You plan on doing something or just hoping it goes away?" Avery blinked. "Sir, we're doing our best to maintain safety on board." "Safety's already been compromised," Calvin replied, not unkindly. "That man assaulted a child. With words. Almost with more. That's not nothing." "I understand. Do you?" She looked at him for a second longer, then down the aisle toward Gregory. He was still, but not sleeping. His fingers tapped against his tray table. One leg bounced occasionally, the fabric of his pants bunching at the knee. "We've alerted the captain," she said at last. "There will be ground support upon arrival." Calvin nodded once. "Good. But," she added, quieter, "we can't restrain someone based on tension. There's protocol." "Funny," he murmured, leaning back into his seat. "Tension gets people shot where I come from." Tanya didn't understand the full meaning of those words, but she felt them. Like something heavy had just passed between grown-ups that kids weren't meant to hear. Something sad. Something real. The woman walked away. The Hume returned. Gregory finally moved. He shifted in his seat, reached down and pulled out his carry-on bag. Slowly, without a word, he unzipped it and began rifling through. Tanya tensed. Her father saw it. "Hey." Derek's voice was louder than it had been all flight. Not yelling, but firm. It cut through the cabin again. Gregory froze, one hand inside the bag. "Don't," Derek said. "Don't what?" Gregory asked, his tone oily, defensive. "Don't even try to act like you don't know what that looks like." Passengers around them stirred again. Some sat up straighter. Others adjusted headphones but didn't turn the volume back up. One woman looked over the back of her seat with concern. Even the baby on the mother's lap had gone quiet. Gregory's eyes flicked from Derek to Calvin. Calvin didn't speak. He didn't even sit up. He just stared, unblinking. Gregory slowly closed the bag. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "You're right," Derek said. It is. Gregory leaned back again. This time, his eyes looked somewhere else. Beyond the aisle. Beyond the cabin. Maybe beyond the moment. He said nothing else. The mother with the toddler passed Derek a folded tissue across the aisle. "For her," she whispered. Tanya took it gently. "Thank you." The woman smiled again. "He's not the world," she said softly. "Just one loud part of it." Tanya didn't say anything, but she held on to that sentence. The lights overhead dimmed a little more as the cabin prepared for descent. The captain's voice came through the intercom, giving updates about landing in 20 minutes. Tanya didn't hear most of it, her ears focused on the way people shifted now. Not nervously, but purposefully. Some took out phones. Others began whispering. The man across the aisle nodded at Derek. Just a simple nod, no words. Another woman, 2 rows up, turned around. "If you need anything when we land, I'll speak up. I saw the whole thing." Derek gave a slow, appreciative smile. "Thank you." One voice had started it, one voice had silenced it, and now other voices were ready. Tanya leaned her head against her dad's arm. "Are we almost there?" He looked down, his face softer now. "Yeah, almost." "Will it be okay?" Derek didn't answer right away. He looked toward Gregory, still fuming in silence. He looked toward Calvin, still watching, patient and composed. He looked at Tanya. "It will be," he said finally, "because you're not alone." The wheels lowered with a loud mechanical groan, and the plane began its descent. Outside the window, Tanya could see pinpricks of city lights growing larger, brighter. The darkness below began to break apart. And for the first time since takeoff, Tanya didn't feel so small anymore. Gregory Hayes didn't like being watched. Not by the girl, not by her father, and especially not by the man in the hoodie who stared at him like he knew everything about him, like he could read through every excuse Gregory had built over the years to explain away the hate that sat heavy in his chest. The plane's cabin felt tight now, too tight, like the air itself had turned against him. The whispering passengers, the glances, the subtle gasps. They burned holes in his skin. He wasn't the bad guy, not really. He just wanted peace, quiet, respect. That girl, that little girl, had disrupted it all, and now somehow he was the problem. Gregory clenched his jaw and rolled his neck. He'd spent the last 30 minutes stewing in silence, biting back words, fists curled in his lap. But the shame didn't sit well. Shame was never something he wore comfortably. It itched and it clawed, and the looks people gave him now, he knew them. Pity, mixed with judgment, like he was some sideshow attraction, like he was the lesson. The seatbelt light blinked back on as the captain warned of slight turbulence before landing. The plane rocked, subtle but jarring enough that Tanya flinched again. That was the match. Gregory jerked forward, slamming his elbow into the armrest and snapping upright. His voice came out loud and sharp. Gasps fluttered down the aisle as he twisted sideways and stood, towering in the narrow lane. "He did it again," he bellowed, pointing a finger down at Tanya. "That's the 3rd damn time she's hit my seat. Enough is enough." Tanya froze. She hadn't moved. Not really. Maybe she shifted. Maybe her knee nudged the seat in front of her. But it wasn't what he was claiming. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Derek stood instantly. The tray table clattered down behind him as his leg knocked it in haste. "She didn't touch you," Derek growled, stepping in front of his daughter. "Back off." "She's been doing it this whole damn flight," Gregory screamed, the vein in his forehead pulsing now, voice booming over the hum of the cabin. "And you've just been letting her act like she runs the place." "You're lying," Derek snapped. Gregory's eyes widened in rage. "You calling me a liar?" "That's exactly what I'm calling you." People were standing now. The flight attendants rushed down the aisle, but it was too late. Gregory's hand moved fast. His whole arm came around in a wide arc like he meant to slap down every accusation and all the judgment that had built up in his head. He wasn't aiming for Tanya, not directly, but her face was the one that had haunted him the entire flight. The child who didn't know her place. The child he felt disrespected by. His open palm met her cheek with a crack that shattered the silence. Everything stopped. Tanya reeled sideways in her seat, her head snapping to the window. Her small hands immediately flew to her face, eyes wide with confusion, pain, and disbelief. Derek lunged forward, roaring. But something else moved quicker. Calvin Morris was out of his seat before anyone else even processed what had happened. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He moved with purpose, smooth and terrifying. Like he'd done this before, like he'd lived in moments like this. Gregory spun around, one hand still raised, not realizing how fast it had escalated. But Calvin was already there. The veteran's hand gripped Gregory's collar and yanked him backward with one brutal, practiced jerk. Gregory slammed into the aisle wall with a thud, the overhead bins rattling above them. Calvin stepped in close, so close that his voice didn't have to rise. "You put your hands on a child." Gregory was wheezing, his eyes darting, panic and anger swirling together. She started it." Calvin leaned in, his hand still fisted in Gregory's collar. "She's 12. A flight attendant, Avery, was shouting now into the cabin phone, alerting the pilot. Another attendant tried to wedge herself between them, but Calvin didn't let go. "I served in 2 wars, he said quietly. "I've seen men break down crying because they couldn't handle the weight of what they'd done. You don't even blink after hitting a little girl. You're not a man. You're a coward with a seat number." "I want him off me," Gregory screamed. "This is assault. You all saw that. He assaulted me." "Elle had protected her," Derek growled, his voice shaking. "That's what that was." Gregory tried to lunge, but Calvin shifted his grip and pressed him back with a quiet, unshakable strength. "You want to escalate?" Calvin asked, his voice like steel. The rest of the passengers were either standing or staring. Several had their phones out, recording. One woman was in tears. Another man murmured, "Good," under his breath. Tanya hadn't moved. She was shaking, her hands still over her cheek. Derek knelt beside her now, tears in his eyes. "Let me see, baby," he whispered. "Let Daddy see." She didn't speak. She just moved her hands. A red mark had bloomed across her face, raw and hot. Derek's jaw trembled. "I'm okay," she finally whispered. "You don't have to say that," he told her. "You don't have to protect anyone right now." Avery returned, her voice low and urgent. "Sir," she said to Calvin, "security is meeting us at the gate. Please, let go." Calvin looked down at Gregory one last time, eyes sharp with disgust, then finally released him. Gregory stumbled into his seat trying to catch his breath, adjusting his shirt like the fabric could fix what had just happened. His lips moved, but no words came out. No one was listening to him anymore anyway. Calvin returned to his row. He sat slowly, his hands still flexed. He didn't reach for his earbuds. He watched. A man behind Tanya passed a bottle of water forward. "For the girl," he said. Another handed Derek a cold pack wrapped in a napkin. "Here, it's from my meal tray, still cold." The kindness came all at once, like a wave. Words of support, nods, murmurs. "We saw it. You did nothing wrong. We've got your back." And still no one looked at Gregory. He sat alone now, sweating, breathing hard, shrinking into a seat that felt suddenly too big for him. The captain's voice came over the speaker again, this time slower. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been alerted to an incident on board. Upon landing, airport security will escort a passenger from the aircraft. "Please remain seated after we arrive at the gate." No one had to ask who they meant. The cabin went quiet again, not in fear, but in resolve. Tanya sipped from the water bottle and leaned into her father's side. Her cheek still stung, but something in her chest had shifted. She felt safer now, not because the plane was close to landing, but because someone stood up. Because they all had, in their own way. Because she knew now she was worth protecting. Calvin Morris hadn't blinked in 5 minutes. He sat still, arms crossed tight over his chest, watching Gregory Hayes like a hawk waiting for a snake to flinch. The man across the aisle hadn't moved since Calvin let him go. He just sat there, small now, broken in all the ways pride couldn't fix. His fingers twitched every few seconds. His shirt was wrinkled from the grip, his collar bent out of shape. But Calvin didn't care. None of it mattered now except the girl and the justice coming for the man who hit her. Tanya had stopped shaking. Her body leaned fully against her father's like she'd finally run out of strength to hold herself up. She clutched a small plush bear in her lap that another passenger had handed her minutes earlier. It wasn't hers, but the soft fur gave her something to press into while the world spun around her. Derek wiped the sweat from his brow and whispered something in her ear. She didn't respond, just nodded once and held tighter. Calvin leaned forward now, his voice low but directed straight across the aisle. "If you ever touch another kid," he said slowly, "you better hope I'm nowhere near." Gregory didn't reply. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. There were no more clever quips, no muttered jabs. His power had drained out of him like air from a punctured balloon. The plane had begun its descent. The engines changed pitch, the nose of the aircraft slightly tilting downward as the captain announced the final approach. Nobody applauded. Nobody even whispered anymore. They were all waiting. The woman who'd recorded the incident earlier scrolled through her phone with purpose. She hit send on the video, uploading it somewhere. Another man spoke quietly to his wife, repeating every detail he'd seen, as if memorizing it for a future statement. Truth hung in the cabin like fog, and no one was pretending not to see it now. Flight attendants passed quickly down the aisle, confirming seatbelts were fastened. Avery, the one who'd first dismissed the complaint, paused beside Derek. "We're very sorry, sir," she said gently, her voice quieter now. "Security will be ready at Gate 9. You'll be asked to stay seated while they escort him out." Derek nodded without looking at her. "Is there a medic waiting?" "Yes, they'll be there, too. For your daughter. I'm truly sorry." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The apology tasted like it came too late. As the landing gear lowered, the cabin rattled with tension. Tanya reached for her father's hand again. This time, Derek kissed the top of her head. "You're okay," he said. "We're almost home." Outside the window, the lights of the airport glowed brighter, crawling up into the sky like fingers reaching out to meet them. The tires touched down with a loud thump, the brakes whining as the plane slowed to a crawl. And then they stopped. The cabin lights flicked on. No one stood. The intercom buzzed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Brighton Regional Airport. Please remain seated. Law enforcement will now enter the aircraft." Silence. Then, footsteps. 2 officers entered through the front. Plain clothes, but with the badges to match. One wore a polo, the other had a leather jacket over his radio harness. Their faces were stern, eyes focused. They didn't walk in asking questions. They already knew. One of them stopped at row 17. "Gregory Hayes?" Gregory raised both hands halfway into the air, a mockery of innocence. "This is ridiculous," he said, trying to chuckle. "You're making a mistake." The officer nearest him shook his head. "Sir, please stand. Slowly." Gregory looked around, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak on his behalf. But no one moved. Not the passengers, not the flight attendants, certainly not Calvin. who now sat with both feet planted firmly on the ground, his back straight, his jaw clenched. Gregory stood. "This is crazy. She kicked me. You don't know what really happened." "I do," the officer said flatly. "So does everyone here." They cuffed him, not roughly, not dramatically, just enough to make it real. As Gregory was led down the aisle, passengers parted like the Red Sea. Some glared, some stared cold and silent. One woman whispered, "Coward." He passed Tanya, still seated. His eyes briefly met hers, and for the first time all day they weren't angry. They were afraid. That look of a man suddenly unsure who he was when no one else agreed with him was worse than rage. Tanya looked away. When the officers disappeared through the front, the cabin finally exhaled. Passengers murmured now, some shaking their heads, some reaching for bags, some staying put. Calvin remained seated. Avery returned, this time with a different kind of urgency. "Mr. Carter," she said to Derek, "if you and your daughter are ready, the medics are waiting." He stood carefully, gathering their things, then helped Tanya to her feet. She stood slower than usual, but stronger than anyone expected. Her chin lifted slightly. Her small fingers held tight to the bear in one hand and her father's in the other. Calvin stood too. "I'll walk with you," he said. Derek looked at him, and for a moment his voice caught in his throat. He nodded. The three of them made their way down the aisle. Tanya in the middle. No one blocked them. No one dared. Some passengers whispered soft things as they passed. "God bless you. You're so brave. We saw everything." When they were seated at her own, the doors opened at gate A9. Flashing lights painted the terminal walls in red and blue. Paramedics stood just beyond the jet bridge, ready. One of them knelt to Tanya's level, asking quiet questions, checking her face, shining a small penlight near her eyes. Tanya answered each question calmly. When the medic offered to take her hand, she shook her head. "I'm okay, just sore." "Feeling she's strong," Derek said. His voice cracked and proud. Behind them, Calvin stood just inside the terminal. An airport officer approached him. "Sir, do you mind answering a few questions?" "Not at all," he replied, his voice like calm water. As Calvin stepped aside with the officer, Derek and Tanya continued toward baggage claim, trailed by paramedics. Tanya walked a little straighter now. Her cheek was still swollen, but her steps weren't small anymore. People watched her walk by, not as a victim, but as something more. When they reached the end of the terminal, Tanya stopped suddenly and turned around. She spotted Calvin across the lobby. He was mid-sentence explaining what happened to the officer, but he turned slightly when he felt her eyes on him. She raised her hand. He raised his back. And that was it. No speeches, no apologies, just a silent salute between a little girl who stood taller than her years and a man who never forgot what it meant to protect. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, pale gold bleeding into the glass. And as Tanya stepped through the automatic doors, the light touched her first. The terminal at Brighton Regional wasn't built for drama. It was small, with off-white tiles that echoed every footstep, and security officers who looked more like tired mall cops than agents of law. A few vending machines lined the walls. Coffee kiosks blinked with half-lit menus. It was a place meant to disappear into the background, not to hold the weight of justice. But today it carried a lot. Calvin Morris stood by the window, arms crossed, giving his statement with the same precision he once used to recite coordinates under enemy fire. He spoke calmly, without exaggeration, just the facts. The officer beside him, Ramirez, scribbled every word with wide eyes and a jaw that had been locked since Calvin first said, "He hit her. No warning. Full force." "That's when I got up," Calvin added. Ramirez nodded, flipping the page on his notepad. "And the flight staff?" He froze, didn't do much. One tried to step in, but after I had him restrained. The officer exhaled. "They should have called for backup sooner." Calvin's gaze drifted out the window. Through the tinted glass he could see Tanya, her small frame leaning into her father's side while the paramedics continued their checks. She was answering questions again, this time with more confidence. She wasn't trembling anymore. Something had shifted in her. She didn't cry, Calvin said, more to himself than to Ramirez. Ramirez followed his eyes. She shouldn't have had to be brave like that. No, Calvin agreed. She shouldn't have. Inside the airport's holding room, Gregory Hayes sat in a chair that was bolted to the floor. His hands were uncuffed but still trembling. His voice was hoarse from arguing. 2 officers stood at the door. He had asked for water 5 times. It hadn't come yet. She was aggressive, he muttered to the room. Kids these days don't respect anything. She kicked my seat over and over. She's a child, the officer near the door said without turning around. And I'm a businessman, Gregory snapped. I have rights. I was provoked. The second officer scoffed. You hit a 12-year-old girl because you were annoyed. Gregory stood, pacing now. Because she was disruptive. Her father let her behave like that. You don't understand. I was in first class last week and the same thing happened. Some kid crying and kicking, and everyone just acted like it was normal. You weren't in first class this time. Gregory's voice dropped. She did it on purpose. You weren't there. We've got 6 video angles saying otherwise, the officer said, holding up a phone. Passengers recorded everything, so sit down. Gregory sat. Out in the terminal, Tanya was finishing with the medics. A woman in a navy blazer had arrived from the airport's passenger services department. She handed Derek a clipboard and offered a free hotel voucher, a meal card, and a number to call if they wanted to file a formal grievance. We'll be reviewing our training, she said, unable to meet Derek's eyes. This kind of incident is unacceptable. Derek signed the form slowly. It wasn't training that failed. It was basic human decency. Tanya tugged at his sleeve. Can we go now? The woman stepped back, cleared her throat. Of course. If you need anything, we'll call, Derek said flatly. They moved toward baggage claim. At the same time, Ramirez wrapped up with Calvin, lowering his pen. Are you military? He asked. Calvin nodded. Navy, retired. I could tell. Calvin offered a brief smile, then reached for the duffel bag at his feet. Ramirez held out a hand. Wait, one last thing. What made you get involved? Calvin paused, slinging the strap over his shoulder. Because no one else did. He left it at that. Down by the baggage carousel, Tanya sat on a metal bench while her dad scanned the rows of suitcases slowly sliding by. The wheels squeaked every few seconds, the only real noise in the quiet space. She looked at her reflection in the polished tile. Her cheeks still had a faint pink mark, less swollen now, but still there. A woman in her 20s passed by and did a double take. She whispered to her boyfriend and pointed. He pulled out his phone. Derek noticed, his body tensing. But Tanya just waved. The man looked embarrassed and tucked his phone away. Sorry, he mumbled. We saw the video. She's amazing. Derek raised an eyebrow. Already? It's everywhere. News picked it up. Man hits girl mid-light. Veteran steps in. It's trending. Tanya blinked. What's trending? Derek smiled. Never mind. You're too young to care. She grinned. Can I still get pancakes? Derek laughed for the first time since the plane. A real laugh. You can get 2 pancakes. They found their bag and moved toward the doors. The weight of what had happened still lingered, but so did something new. Strength. Not just the kind Calvin had shown, but the quiet kind Tanya had found in herself. Back in the airport holding room, Gregory was being escorted out in cuffs. He wasn't yelling anymore. He didn't say a word, because on some level even he knew his words didn't matter anymore. His story was already being rewritten by witnesses, footage, and a girl whose silence had spoken louder than anything he had said all flight. In the parking garage, Calvin unlocked his truck and slid into the driver's seat. Before turning the key, he took a moment. His hand rested on the steering wheel, thumb tracing the grooves worn into the leather. He pulled out his phone. One message blinked from a number labeled "Daughter Maya." "Heard about the flight. You okay?" Calvin stared at the screen for a long moment. Then typed, "Yeah. Made sure a little girl got home safe." He hit send, then started the engine. Outside, Tanya and Derek loaded their bag into a cab. The sun had risen higher now, warming the windshield as the car pulled away from the curb. Tanya leaned her head back and looked at her father. "How much did he do it?" Derek hesitated, then said, "Some people carry ugliness inside, and they don't know where to put it, so they throw it at the first person who can't fight back." She looked out the window. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't," he said, "and you never have to make yourself smaller for people like that." She nodded slowly, then whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." And neither was he. The next morning, the world knew Tanya Satterfield's name. Not from a school honor roll, not from a spelling bee or a summer camp photo, but from a grainy video taken on a plane, now stitched together with voiceovers, news anchors, and hashtags. The clip was less than 30 seconds. Her eyes widened. The man's voice rose, and then came the slap, raw, vicious, unforgivable, then silence. Then Calvin Morris standing like an immovable wall between a child and the world's worst version of adulthood. All of it. It had gone viral before the sun came up. By 7:00 a.m., Derek's phone had buzzed over 24 times. Reporters, attorneys, strangers offering support, people asking for interviews. He turned every one of them down. Tanya sat beside him at their kitchen table, eating cereal. Her cheek was mostly healed. The swelling had faded overnight, leaving just a shadow of the moment, a soft outline that would vanish in a few days. But the strength she'd earned from it, that wasn't going anywhere. "Can I go back to school today?" she asked, chewing thoughtfully. Derek looked up from his phone. "If you want. I don't want to miss art class." He smiled. "Then art class it is." The ride to school was quiet. Tanya stared out the window, watching trees blur past. The same streets she'd seen 100 times somehow looked newer today, like she'd stepped out of one story and into another. Her backpack was heavier, though she hadn't added anything to it. She carried the weight differently now, less about books, more about the eyes that would be on her when she walked through those classroom doors. "You don't have to explain anything," Derek said as he pulled into the school's loop. "Not to teachers, not to friends, not to anyone." Tanya nodded. "I'm proud of you," he added. She leaned over and hugged him tightly before slipping out of the car. Inside the school building, everything was the same, but different. The same lockers, same walls, same bulletin board with bright paper leaves taped to a tree trunk that read "Falling into Kindness." But whispers followed her now. Not cruel ones, curious ones. "That's her. The girl from the plane. She's the one who stood still." Mrs. Carter, her homeroom teacher, met her at the door with a warm smile. "I saved your seat," she said gently. Tanya smiled back and sat down. Class began like normal, but nothing really was. By lunchtime, a girl named Mariah, usually too shy to say much, slid into the bench beside her and whispered, "I saw what happened. You're really brave." Tanya blinked. "I didn't do anything." Mariah tilted her head. "You didn't hit back. That's something." Later, in the hallway, her principal pulled her aside. "We've arranged for someone to speak to the class," he said, "about bias and justice and courage. You're not alone, Tanya." She didn't cry. She just nodded. Across town, Calvin Morris sat in a local coffee shop, his phone buzzing again and again. The network morning shows had left voicemails. CNN wanted him for a remote interview. A national podcast sent a producer to find him. But he ignored them all. He didn't stop Tanya's assault for attention. He didn't stand up for applause. He did it because it was right. The barista walked over with his usual black coffee and smiled. "You're him, huh? From the video." Calvin looked up, surprised. "Didn't think anyone around here noticed." She smiled wider. "Are you kidding? Everyone noticed. That little girl's lucky you were there." He shook his head. "I was lucky to be there." Later that afternoon, after school ended, Derek pulled into the parking lot of Gate B32, a part of the airport usually reserved for employees. It had been arranged by someone in the terminal operations office. A favor, a thank you. Tanya climbed out of the car and saw Calvin waiting by a picnic bench just outside the secure zone. She walked up slowly. Calvin rose to his feet. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Tanya reached into her backpack and pulled out a small piece of paper folded in half. "I wrote you something," she said shyly. He took it gently and opened it. Inside was a crayon drawing, simple, bright, and powerful. A little girl with curly hair stood next to a tall man in a dark shirt. Between them, the words, "Thank you for seeing me," were scribbled in purple marker. Calvin didn't speak for a long moment. Then he kneeled down to her level. "I saw you," he said, "because you matter. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd still stand up." Tanya hugged him. Lightly, he hugged her back. Derek watched from a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, his throat tight. When Tanya pulled back, she wiped her eyes and asked, "Are you gonna be okay?" Calvin smiled. "Yeah, you?" She nodded. They said goodbye without needing to say much more. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the tarmac, Tanya and Derek walked back to the car. The world hadn't changed. Not entirely, but something had shifted. A man who thought his anger gave him power had been proven wrong by a child who chose dignity over fear, and by a veteran who knew that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of violence. As the car rolled away from Gate B32, Tanya leaned her head against the window, watching the golden light stretch across the sky. "Daddy?" "Yeah, bud? Can we go to the museum this weekend, the one with the Freedom Wall?" He smiled, eyes on the road. "We can do anything you want."